Although this is the plan for this lecture, you know that it is likely to go on for another 7 lectures. I hope you are fresh after a 10 days break, as I am. And I have used these 10 days also to further deepen even my study, get my act together. So I'm in a little bit of fix also. Because it occurs to me that we have completed 11 sessions. And I'm asking myself, what did we do for 11 sessions? That we are still skimming at the surface of our understanding of the Constitution. So here is continuation of the previous session, which was essentially on the legislature and executive. But today, with my refreshed approach, I seek to add the basic understanding of judiciary also to the same topic. So one area we are going to deal with today are these 3 pillars of our democracy: legislature, executive, judiciary. Then we start studying the real heart and soul of the Constitution, that is, fundamental rights and directive principles both together. They get centered around this gripping struggle, really. It's a gripping struggle of how the Constitution unfolds, how the words there in the Constitution are implemented in day-to-day life, and it becomes a struggle. Maybe you can call it a power struggle or the struggle for turf. Everybody seeking the claim to protect the Constitution. So it is legislature versus executive, executive versus judiciary, legislature versus judiciary, and finally it all gets down to a particular case which we are going to study in deeper details. That turns out to be legislature and executive on one side versus judiciary on the other hand. But it is through that struggle that the concept of basic structure of the Constitution came to be defined. This is our ambitious plan for this session. I know that it looks like it's impossible to complete it during today's session. Let's see how it unfolds. Last time we stopped, we were taking a look at various legislative procedures and various legislative committees. And then I had decided to speak about one particular example. I made a choice of not rushing through it. So we said we'll continue next time with that particular example. Indian Constitution defines the tenure of houses, elected houses, as 5 years. But there is no provision for what is called as constructive vote of no confidence. So there is a tenure, but there is no provision for fixed tenure. The term to be understood here is fixed tenure. That is there in the German Constitution. German Bundestag, as it is called, has a fixed tenure of 4 years. And there will be regular elections only once every 4 years. There is no concept of midterm dissolution of the House. And similarly, there is no concept of no confidence motion alone. Just pass the no confidence motion. And then there is a hung parliament or hung assembly, and for a while there is no government, so nobody knows what's happening. But Indian Constitution did not contemplate either fixed tenure for the elected houses or the concept of constructive vote of no confidence. Constructive vote of no confidence would mean that any elected member or the political party moving a vote of no confidence against the sitting government will have to state in the same resolution. The no confidence motion itself will have to state which government will replace it. So the German Constitution contemplates this situation that nobody should be able to only bring a sitting government down unless you are sure which government will replace it. I hope you can see that the two have to go together. Fixed tenure and constructive vote of no confidence have to go together. only one cannot be there in absence of the other. It will be a failure. It will create various constitutional deadlocks. But Indian Constitution had not considered this. That gave rise to houses being required to be dissolved midway through, the midterm elections, and one of the issues that is being discussed now, which we touched upon in the last session, that is the issue of simultaneous elections for Lok Sabha and Vidhan Sabhas. There is no provision in the Constitution. But Constitution also takes us to the rules of business which define how the houses will function. It is these rules of business which make it possible for Lok Sabha and Vidhan Sabha elections to be conducted simultaneously. Without any such express provision, for first 20 years of our democratic experiment after independence, the elections for Lok Sabha and Vidhan Sabha happened simultaneously. 1951-52, the first one, stretched over a longer duration really. The 1951-52 election commenced in October 1951 and went on till February 1952. But then 56, 61, 66, these are elections for Lok Sabha and Vidhan Sabha simultaneously, and then the whole disruption which we have paid our attention to the whole issue. And now from that fork in 1966-67, the paths diverged, the path of Lok Sabha and the paths of various Vidhan Sabhas. Now they are so complex that at any given point of time, there is always an election going on somewhere or other. So now like it is Karnataka on voting on May 12 and counting on May 15, the moment Election Commission announces the elections, Code of Conduct goes into action. And while it's an election for the state, the Code of Conduct is applicable for Government of India also, to the extent to which Government of India decisions are likely to impact Karnataka. It is difficult to think of even a single decision by Government of India which will not affect Karnataka. It's a major state in the country, so it's like a limbo for a while. And always that Code of Conduct, somewhere this way or that way, has indeed brought about some disruptive culture in our constitutional functioning. So the discussion again, and we had touched upon that area last time. Now that we don't have fixed tenure and the vote of no, constructive vote of no confidence, the houses get dissolved and there is no arrangement for an alternative government, that creates disruption in our constitutional functioning. This general background with which some of you have already started acting like you are bored. Actually, माझी फार इच्छा, मी तुम्हाला एकदा बोर कसं बोलायचं हे पण दाखवून देतो. Constitution Article 15 and Article 16, guarantee. दाखवतो ना तुम्हाला बोलून. Now this is a case of NDA government headed by Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and a no confidence motion was moved by the then leader of opposition Lalu Prasad Yadav. The decisive date is April 17, 1999. That single episode takes us way deeper into understanding of all kinds of issues. A no confidence motion has to be supported, even for the motion to move, to be tabled, has to be supported by at least 50 MPs. I'm expecting you to know that such a discussion is on now. I'm also expecting you to know that whatever no confidence motion comes in now, the present government is most likely to survive and complete 5 years and go to the elections, maybe whatever time the government decides, within the framework of 6 months. But a similar no confidence motion was mobilized by the leader of the opposition, Lalu Prasad Yadav. That was supported by 50 MPs. So the speaker, that was Captain Sangma at that point of time, allowed the no confidence motion to move ahead. As per the methodology of the no confidence motion, the one who tables the motion gives the first speech. So Lalu Prasad, in his quintessential style, and don't underestimate him, and don't go by the fact of where he is right now. As a politician, he is very shrewd and he was brilliant. So he moved the motion and gave a fiery speech about why this government was a failure on all fronts and the House has lost confidence in this government. Then as per the system, the head of the government rises up to give the first response. The head of the government is Prime Minister. That was Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Still it was 1999. So he was also in the pink of his health and at the best of his oratory also. I would also urge you not to underestimate Atal Bihari Vajpayee also as a politician, mind you. With his pleasant face and outstanding oratory, he comes across as a poet, which he is. People tend to forget that he is as consummate a politician as like many others. So Atal Bihari Vajpayee stood up and the very first sentence he said is, कि हमारी सरकार तो गिराओगे, ये तो बताओ कि किसकी लाओगे. This was a multi-dimensional missile thrown in the direction of opposition, because it was easier for the opposition to come together to bring down a government. But if there is a question of which government will replace, there were like at least a dozen prime ministers in waiting. So Congress would not accept anybody other than Sonia Gandhi to be the Prime Minister. And Sharad Pawar had just left, not yet, not in April, not yet. It was another month and a half that he left Congress on this very point of Sonia Gandhi's foreign nationality, original foreign nationality. But like Mamata Banerjee also wanted to be Prime Minister, why shouldn't Lalu Prasad want to be Prime Minister? Mulayam Singh is always a self-proclaimed Prime Minister forever. And Jayalalitha, until she was with us physically, she nurtured this ambition of becoming the Prime Minister. So like there were many, and Atal Bihari Vajpayee knew that this unity of the opposition is only to bring the government down. You create a question, which government will you bring in? Hamari to sarkar giraoge, kaun si laoge? Lalu Prasad, shrewd that he was, he immediately understood the implications and he stood up and he said, पहले आपकी सरकार गिरने तो दो, 5 मिनट में बनाएंगे दूसरी सरकार. This is not just a funny statement. He knows the constitutional provision that the constitution or no confidence motion doesn't ask for which government will replace this. It's only a one-line motion. This House expresses loss of confidence in this government. And the voting is only on that single point. If Atal Bihari Vajpayee were able to dictate this political agenda, making opposition to think about which government will replace, the no confidence motion was almost bound to fail. So Lalu Prasad immediately responded. Atal Bihari Vajpayee gave the rest of the speech in his extraordinary fashion. The debate went on for 3 days and finally on April 17, the no confidence motion was to be put to vote. Then a point of order was raised by Lal Krishna Advani. He was Deputy Prime Minister then. What had happened was, sitting Chief Minister of Orissa, that was Hemchandra Biswal, was asked by Sonia Gandhi, the President of Congress, it was Congress government in Orissa then, and she had asked him to resign, accepting the moral responsibility for a gang rape that happened in Orissa Secretariat, mind you. During office hours, this sad and angry incident, angering, every right-thinking person should feel even angry for this, that a government servant woman was gang raped in the Orissa Secretariat, and Sonia Gandhi directed the Chief Minister to accept moral responsibility and resign. There is no way Hemchandra Biswal won't resign. He wants his politics to continue. So Hemchandra Biswal resigned and Girdhar Gomang was then asked to be the Chief Minister. Girdhar Gomang was MP in the Lok Sabha. As per the constitutional provision, while the head of the government has to be member of either of the houses, there is a window period of 6 months that at the point of swearing in, the person may not be member of any house, but then within 6 months from the date of swearing in, the person has to be member of one of the two houses. So, can an MP become the chief minister of a state? The answer goes both ways, yes and no. And Girdhar Gomang was sworn in as the chief minister of Orissa. That window period of 6 months was still on, which means he was still MP, and he was chief minister of Orissa. So the point of order that was raised was that, Mr. Speaker, sir, he is chief minister of a state. So the morality of democracy calls for his presence in that house. Constitution also says that nobody can be member of two houses at the same time. Can you contest an election for 2 seats? You can. Can you be elected for 2 different houses? You can be. But from that point of election, you have to decide which one house you are going to continue and which the other one. So had Girdhar Gomang contested election from some other constituency, the answer was no, not yet. It was that 6-month period. But Lal Krishna Advani raised a point that he is the chief minister of a state, which means from democratic logic, he has to be there in that house. So no member can be in 2 houses at the same time. So we are requesting you to direct him either not to be present in the house or not to vote. I hope you begin to see the gripping complication in the issue. Shivraj Patil immediately stood up to respond on behalf of Congress. He is as well studied on constitutional matters as is Lal Krishna Advani. And please also remember that Shivraj Patil himself, known as Ajata Shatru like, was a speaker of our parliament, so he knew the procedures. So Shivraj Patil stood up and pointed out that, Mr. Speaker, sir, all constitutional provisions have been followed. That he can be sworn in as the Chief Minister of Orissa until he gets elected, and that 6-month period is still on, which means during that time he is still MP, and which means he enjoys all the rights of an MP. This single issue went on for like 2 hours. Then, as we have studied by now that the Speaker's decision is final, it came finally to Captain Sangma. And Captain Sangma, also known as a very erudite person, a very well studied on constitutional matters, nobody questioned his impartiality also. He said, I leave it to the conscience of the distinguished member of the House. Which means he also refused to rule on this point. And Girdhar Gomang continued to be in the House. Every single issue will become important when we know that finally no confidence motion was passed with a margin of 270 versus 269. And the government collapsed, mind you. So start thinking about this. Had Speaker decided that Girdhar Gomang cannot vote, then it would have been 269 each. That gives the Speaker the right to cast, that is called casting vote. And if it came to casting vote, everyone was clear that Captain Sangma would vote for NDA. He was a part of NDA, so he would vote for continuation of the government, which means the government, rather than collapsing by a margin of 270 versus 269, would have actually survived by a margin of 270 versus 269. Every single seat. Then there was National Conference, which was part of NDA. National Conference had 3 MPs. One of them was the minister, that was Omar Abdullah himself. He was Minister of State for External Affairs in Vajpayee cabinet at that point of time. National Conference, as a constituent element of NDA, had issued a formal whip asking all 3 MPs to vote against the motion, that is, vote in favor of the government. This whip was under anti-defection law. Anti-defection law passed in 1985, January 1985, at the behest of Rajiv Gandhi himself. This came in as the 52nd constitutional amendment. Anti-defection law had been under discussion for almost 20 years before that time. That I would like to say that we have reviewed, that all horse trading in Indian democracy can be said to have began in the right earnest from 1966-67, when Congress lost its majority in 8 assemblies in North India, and then Janasangha and Socialist under the respective leadership of Pandit Deen Dayal Upadhyay and Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia came together, formed what then came to be called as Samvida, Sanyukta Vidhayak Dal. But they had wafer-thin majority, and if only some 2, 3 or 4 MLAs changed their sides, the governments would collapse. So those governments did not last, but that is truly the beginning of what is called as Ayaram Gayaram culture, and selling and purchasing, Ghode Bazar, the horse trading. So the demand for anti-defection law was there for like almost 20 years, that it is breach of people's mandate. It is a breach of trust. Because in democracy, when people vote, it means they are not only voting for a person, they are voting for the party, they are voting for ideology, they are voting for manifesto. And then you get elected on the ticket of a particular party, and for maybe some either your genuine change in conviction, or your expediency, your political selfish interest, you change the sides. That is breach of mandate. So the discussion was on, and the anti-defection bill had also been presented at various times, but like we have seen, the first reading, second reading, third reading, if required, select committee, etc., has to happen during the lifetime of that given parliament. It could not be completed, so it just went on and on and on for like 20 years. Finally, when anti-defection law came in, it came in with a lot of provisos, one of which was that if the party issues a whip and a member votes against that whip, that calls for action under anti-defection law. But calling for action under anti-defection law does not mean that by the very fact of the member defying the whip, the member loses his or her seat in the House. That's not how it is supposed to work. If a member defies the whip, the party is required to inform it to the Speaker. And then taking action against that member under anti-defection law is the prerogative of the Speaker. Now, in this case, the parties had issued the whip, which means National Conference MPs, 3, they were required to vote against the no confidence motion. But anti-defection law also has a provision that if 1/3 or more members defect, then the provisions of anti-defection law will not be attracted. That will be held as party split, and no action under anti-defection law would be taken. India has seen even a travesty of implementation of anti-defection law since its passage. A very sad conclusion with respect to anti-defection law indeed is that it's a failure, because we are very intelligent people. Earlier in 1990, Chhagan Bhujbal, then a major leader of Shiva Sena had 52 seats. So if it were to be a party split, at least 18 MLAs were required to defect. In December 1990, the winter session that takes place at Nagpur, I was very much a serving officer at Nagpur over there. Chhagan Bhujbal defected with 18 MLAs. And a list of 18 MLAs from Shiva Sena was submitted to the governor saying these 18 have defected, so it's a party split, no action under anti-defection law. Next day the news came out, and once the news came out, 6 out of those 18 MLAs, 6 Shiva Sena MLAs out of those 18, they started crying foul and shouting from rooftops that they never signed anything about defecting from Shiva Sena. They said our signatures are there, but it was on some other petition, and the page was taken out, attached to this one, submitting a list of 18, 12 on one page, 6 on another page. So the 6 of them said we had never defected from Shiva Sena. That would actually mean that only 12 out of 52 defected. So if required, there would be action under anti-defection law against all of them. If you still think so, you are still underestimating our political intelligence. The speaker took a decision that as per speaker's decision, his first decision was, I hereby declare that these 18 split from Shiv Sena. And he recognized that these 18 are a separate group in the assembly, Vidhan Sabha. Okay? And then when 6 say we had not defected, he accepted their submission and he said because they 6 are 1/3 of the 18, they are back to Shiv Sena, but no action under anti-defection law. And finally, those 12 who finally ended up by defecting, every one of them got some or other post, cabinet or some Mahamandal or some. It's a travesty that goes on. So with National Conference also on 17 April 1999, National Conference had issued a whip asking all NC MPs to vote against no confidence motion. Then as we know now, another wiliest of a wily politician and a great artist himself, a great poet himself, Vishwanath Pratap Singh, an ex-Prime Minister. He was suffering from cancer and he was in a London hospital. From there he called up National Conference MP Saifuddin and asked him to vote against the communal government. That this is communal government and it is our job to ensure that they are brought down. So he told Saifuddin. Saifuddin bought it. When the voting happened, National Conference MP Saifuddin voted in favor of no confidence motion. You don't have to be a mathematical genius to see what would have happened had he voted as per the party whip. Same. Instead of the government collapsing by a margin of 270 versus 269, the government would have survived by a margin of 270 versus 269. Then can National Conference then write to the speaker saying he has defied the whip, so his membership should be cancelled? The party can. Can the party take any action against him? Again, the answer is party can. The Lok Sabha also can. Okay, but it has to be during the lifetime of that Lok Sabha. Once that Lok Sabha was dissolved, there is and there can be no action against MP Saifuddin. Then BSP, then led by Mayawati, had 5 MPs including herself. And Mayawati, talking about this no confidence motion, also gave a very fiery speech, but the theme of her speech was Dono chor hai. Dono chor hai. In so many words, she said, we are not in favor of this government. ये भी चोरों की सरकार है, लेकिन इनकी जगह जो आने वाले हैं या बात कर रहे हैं वो भी चोर हैं. So she said, we don't want this government. We don't want this government. But we also don't want the another government to come to power. But we want to bring down this government. She declared in her speech on the floor of Lok Sabha that BSP will abstain from voting. BSP will abstain from voting. Please remember that this is what she said on the floor of the parliament. What you say on the floor of the parliament has to be followed. Otherwise, it is breach of privilege and action can be taken under breach of privilege. But at the time of voting, all 5 BSP MPs voted in favor of no confidence motion. She had stood up in the parliament and told that we will abstain. But the next day, all 5 voted in favor of no confidence motion. This amounts to lying to the parliament, mind you. Lying to them. And this could have called for action under breach of privilege. But again, all breach of privilege proceedings have to happen during the life of that particular Lok Sabha. And eventually this Lok Sabha had to be dissolved because eventually no other government could be formed. And we are going to come to that point, that single example. So her 5 MPs voted in favor. Again, you don't have to be a mathematical genius to see what would have happened if she had kept her word? Then the government would have survived with a margin of 269 versus 265. But the government would have survived, and eventually there could be no action for for breach of privilege against her. 270 versus 269. And with his consummate vision also about even politics, the question that Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the Prime Minister, had raised, हमारी तो सरकार गिराओगे, किसकी लाओगे ये बताओ. So the government collapsed finally with a margin of 270 versus 269, and all kinds of haggling went on for about 15 days, during which the final conclusion was nobody is in a position to form government. Now, position to form government would mean having the confidence of the House, which in this case would mean proving that you have the support of 273 MPs, any group, any combination, finally proving that they have, and they have to convince the President that they have the support, or the President also has to President also has to finally conclude or be satisfied that this particular leader is most likely to enjoy the confidence of the House. In fact, the political scene was such where it was in fact clear that nobody enjoys the confidence of the House. So the President had no choice but to dissolve the House. He asked the Election Commission, are you ready for elections? Election Commission expressed regret. Election Commission said, as per the constitutional provision, this is a time for intensive revision of electoral rolls. So we are not ready. Then the President asked Election Commission, how much of time you need? Election Commission requested for 6 months. And the President could neither dissolve the House, so that was end of Lok Sabha, but new elections could not be conducted. The Constitution has this provision that if a particular House comes to an end, that is dissolution, the next House has to come into existence. Either there is a fixed date as per the tenure or within 6 months. So that was that window period. In fact, there is a constitutional deadlock over there because Indian Constitution has no provision for caretaker government. There is nothing like caretaker government. Under our constitutional scheme, there either is government with full powers to take all decisions, or there is no government and there are elections. But on and after April 17, 1999, India saw a situation where the sitting government had collapsed, but nobody was in a position to form the government, and Election Commission was not yet constitutionally, statutorily and administratively in a position to conduct elections. So the President found out the path by asking Vajpayee government to continue until elections happen and new government is put in place. There is no constitutional term caretaker government, mind you. Those constitutions which have the term caretaker government, then it would mean that such a government does not have power to take any major policy decision or form a program or undertake a budget or start implementing it. It is there only to look after day-to-day administration so that the country has a government until the new government is put in place by people's mandate. Indian Constitution did not contemplate any such situation about a caretaker government. It's in 1999 that the President only requested Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who had tendered his resignation as Prime Minister on the no confidence motion being passed. He had formally tendered his resignation. In response to that resignation, the President requested him to continue until new arrangements are there. We would actually do well to also remember that then India faced a major situation because the whole Kargil situation came to light in May 99. And we had to mobilize our army, undertake military action. It was a full-blown war for a month and a half during June and July 1999. And eventually the elections did happen in 1999. The constitutional problems and deadlocks created by this one. So the need for fixed tenure, simultaneous elections, and the concept of constructive vote of no confidence. There are two classic examples from Maharashtra. Why is my mind not sure whether I have shared these two examples with you? Did I? You don't seem to remember anything about 10 days ago. In the assembly elections of March 1995, Shiva Sena BJP combined got 138 seats in the House of 288. They were 138 together, out of which Shiva Sena had 72 and BJP had 66. But even then, Congress, which was a united party till then, NCP had not yet come into existence, still had about 90, some 89 or 90 seats, creating a constitutional issue for the governor's powers and duties as to who should be called to form the government first. Sharad Pawar, as the leader of Congress, staked his claim, saying we are still the largest single party. So that to be used as a criteria, that the first invitation should be issued to the largest single party. There is no such criteria laid down in the constitution, mind you, but most of democracy functions on customs, pratha. A very fine word, another fine word is precedent. Constitution says that governor will invite that leader who, in the subjective satisfaction of the governor, is most likely to enjoy the confidence of the House. Enjoying the confidence of the House means having 50% plus 1 seats, members who support him. There is no other criteria. So the governor, when there is a hung assembly, and similarly the president when there is a hung parliament, and nobody is sure which leader enjoys the confidence of the House, president and governors respectively derive some discretionary power. Rest of them are like only customs or precedents. So 1995 March, Sharad Pawar staked a claim saying we are still the largest single party, allow us to form the government and give us time frame to prove the majority. Shiva Sena BJP combined also staked the claim saying we should be considered, our strength should be considered together, not 72 and 66 separately. So we should be given the first invitation. Maharashtra's governor P.C. Alexander, I'm already saying, made a right choice and laid down a right precedent in using 2 criteria. His first criteria was, in the dissolved House, it was Congress government with 141 seats. Congress had 141 seats in the assembly elections of 1990. So you had 141 seats. People have reduced you from 141 to 89 or whatever, or 90. So he said, I interpret people's mandate as not in favor of you forming the government. You were sitting government and people have not returned you elected with enough number of seats, criteria number 1. And criteria number 2, which has become very crucial for Indian functioning of our constitutional machinery. Criteria number 2 he used was that Shiva Sena BJP alliance is a pre-election alliance, not post-election alliance. If it were a post-election alliance, it would only mean political expediency, that numbers match. So they just come together for like political selfish interest and form the government. Here Shiva Sena BJP were together. They went to people on one common manifesto, and in all 288, there wasn't a single constituency in which Shiva Sena and BJP members fought with each other. So P.C. Alexander used that as a criteria, that this is a pre-election alliance. As far as the House is concerned, I'm going to hold them as one unit. So they have 138 first invitation to. Then within the alliance, Shiva Sena and BJP had decided that whichever party gets more number of seats, chief minister will be from that party and the deputy chief minister will be from the other party. So Shiva Sena picked up Manohar Joshi as the leader. BJP picked up Gopinath Munde as the leader. P.C. Alexander issued first invitation to Manohar Joshi to form the government. He laid down a very proper criteria. That brings us again to October 1999, because once the Vajpayee government collapsed at the center, elections were required to be conducted. But like I already said, Election Commission had conveyed inability to conduct the elections at least until October. So the elections happened in October 1999. Think of it carefully. There was no need for Maharashtra Assembly to be dissolved. because Maharashtra Assembly had come into being by March 15, 1995. So the next assembly had to be constituted by March 15, 2000. So there was time frame available. But the political atmosphere of October 1999 was all in favor of NDA in general and Vajpayee and BJP in particular. Thanks to also the way Kargil issue was handled, and Indian Army had registered victory by July 26, which we observe as the victory day. So it was considered, there was this general atmosphere in the country that Vajpayee will come back to power. So the state government thought that we would benefit from that, like pro-Vajpayee, pro-BJP like wave, the opinion, and we would come back to power. There was another political factor whereby Sharad Pawar had left Congress and established NCP on June 10, 1999. And then that 6-month window period was already on. So the state government had authority to request the governor to dissolve the house anytime during last 6 months of the house. So the month of October was already during that time frame. So in its political wisdom, state Sena BJP government of Maharashtra passed the resolution to dissolve the house and requested governor to direct the election commission to conduct elections. So the simultaneous elections happened. But Maharashtra voter gave a very mixed verdict. For Lok Sabha, Maharashtra voter gave clear majority for Shiva Sena BJP together. But for the state assembly, in spite of Congress splitting into two, and in spite of all 288 constituencies seeing a direct fight of Congress and NCP with each other, Shiva Sena BJP were still brought down. And there was a very peculiar situation whereby Shiva Sena BJP both together were around 92, 95 something. They were brought down from 138 to now like 92 or 95. And neither Congress nor NCP, nobody, one could claim as largest single party, no addition could produce the figure of 145. Then again, Shiva Sena BJP together staked a claim saying we are pre-election alliance. So as far as the assembly is concerned, we should be considered together. First invitation should be given to us, allow us to form the government and give us a time limit to prove majority. Alexander refused to do that. Remember the first criteria. You were sitting government and you had 138 seats. People have brought you down from 138 to like 92 or 95, whatever. So not the first invitation. For 6 weeks, there was no government for Maharashtra. And no government could be formed unless Congress and NCP came together. In fact, even their addition was not 144, that is 145, but Congress and NCP. Anybody minus any combination, minus Congress or NCP could not garner 145, could not garner 145 seats. But governor waited for 6 months. It was only after that time frame that finally Congress and NCP came together. And then Shekapa, etc., CPM, every once in a while, one or a couple of seats there, they could then, their addition exceeded 145, and it is only then that the governor issued invitation to the leader, that was Vilasrao Deshmukh at that point of time, to form the government, and then gave him a time frame to prove majority, which eventually he proved. The point is, Alexander as governor of Maharashtra indeed laid down very proper criteria for the functioning of legislature and who should be invited first. Under our constitutional scheme, president doesn't have much of discretion. In fact, you could say that until the 42nd amendment, which was effected in December 1976, the president was not under any constitutional obligation to sign whatever Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha resolve or whatever the Council of Ministers asked him or her to sign. That was slightly vague. It's only the 42nd constitutional amendment which makes it clear that the president shall sign. The wording president shall sign. Otherwise, we have seen the legislative procedure that Lok Sabha passes a particular statute, Rajya Sabha approves it, and Council of Ministers then hands it over to the President for signature. Until the 42nd Amendment, there was no express provision asking the President, making it mandatory upon the President to sign it. That's why there was a flashpoint around the Hindu Code Bill. That originally our Constituent Assembly wanted Uniform Civil Code. Another subject eventually which we'll study in greater details. Modern law in India begins to come about after 1860. That is the Indian Penal Code drafted by Macaulay. Beginning with Indian Penal Code, the criminal law is uniform irrespective of your caste, clan, religion, sex, etc., etc. So criminal law is uniform for Hindus and Muslims altogether. Civil laws were different. Then the British government of India had passed a Sharia Act in 1937. So Muslims in India were governed by that Sharia Act, which was supposed to be based on original Sharia in the 7th century. When the Constituent Assembly was functioning, there was a general consensus that we are making new unified one India, no denomination, no distinction on the basis of caste, clan, religion, sex, etc. Please remember that that would be true secularism. But the Muslims, not all, but some of the Muslim members of the Constituent Assembly raised exception. They said we want to be governed by Sharia and this should not be imposed on us. Constituent Assembly in its wisdom chose not to impose uniform civil code against the wishes of a particular section of society, but also chose not to forget the subject. So the Constituent Assembly put it in Directive Principles of State Administration, Part 4 or Chapter 4 of the Constitution. As I am expecting you to know that Chapter 3 is all fundamental rights, which are justiciable. That is, one single citizen also can file a suit, approach the court against the government if that single citizen feels that he or she he finds that fundamental rights are abrogated, and the judiciary, as the watchdog of the Constitution, the protector of the common citizens' fundamental rights, they are justiciable. But our Constituent Assembly, in its wisdom, drafted Part 4. Those are Directive Principles of State Administration. The concept was picked up from Ireland and brought in Article 44, which talks about Uniform Civil Code, that the state shall endeavor to bring about Uniform Civil Code. Founding fathers of the Constitution entrusted this as the responsibility of the government, and that is the state with capital S, to get people's mind ready, bring them around discussion table, ensure each community, and develop a consensus, and then bring about Uniform Civil Code. The state shall endeavor to bring about Uniform Civil Code, Article 44. All Nehru, Patel, and especially Babasaheb Ambedkar wanted Uniform Civil Code. But on finding that it's not coming through, and Article 44 was put in there, Babasaheb Ambedkar saw it as his dream to give a modern, rational law for the majority community in the country, that is about 85% of the total. Our Constitution has what I would call as a kind of a negative definition of the term Hindu, which is now being discussed again because Karnataka government in its wisdom chose to ask the central government to declare Lingayats as a separate minority religion. That's not going to happen, that's a different matter. But the Constitution has a kind of a negative definition of who are Hindus. From constitutional point of view, those who are not Muslims, Christians and Parsis are covered under the term Hindu. So from constitutional point of view, Buddha, Jain and Sikh are covered under the term Hindu. Later on, some constitutional functioning may declare Buddhism as a separate religion and Jainism as a separate religion and Sikhism. Therefore, each one becomes the minority. And now this race for each like subsection, sub-community to get itself declared as a man. Another very vexed constitutional issue. These are Articles 25 and 30. But Babasaheb Ambedkar saw this as his dream that, okay, if uniform civil code is not possible for the entire population of India, let us at least have this modern, rational, that is actually the form of uniform civil code for the majority community, that is about 85% of the total. That is Hindu Code Bill. In fairness, one has to say that even Nehru was in favor of Hindu Code Bill, but the President of the Constituent Assembly, who also went on to be the first President of independent India also, that is Babu Rajendra Prasad, who also was an outstanding freedom fighter, a selfless person who had dedicated his life to the country, and in addition to all that, he himself was an outstanding advocate. He was an expert in law. As the President of the Indian Republic, he took objection to Hindu Code Bill. Unless we go deeper into the study, somehow we feel, or there are some books which make us feel, that Rajendra Prasad was a conservative Hindu. So he did not want the modern, rational law for Hindu community. Remember that Hindu Code Bill is nothing short of revolutionary, because for the first time in like thousands of years of history of India, here is a law that declares caste system as unlawful. Entire abolition of caste system, using caste as a criteria, except of course where the constitution specifically mentions scheduled caste and scheduled tribe. Otherwise, from public life, from private life, the entire caste system is abolished. We know that that has not practically happened in last 70 years, but the very provision in the constitution and Hindu Code Bill, it's nothing short of revolution. In one stroke, Hindu Code Bill also ensures equal position for women in society and all equal rights, all right to inheritance, right to property, transfer of property, rights under the marriage and all there. So in one stroke, Hindu women become equals in the society. So Hindu Code Bill itself is a revolutionary step. And Ambedkar saw this as his greatest contribution to India. He is on record having said this, that Hindu Code Bill is my greatest contribution to India. Personally, as law minister in Nehru's cabinet, he knew that his days were numbered. He knew that death was staring at him, and he wanted to see passage of Hindu Code Bill, Yachi Dehi Yachi Dola, during his lifetime. So he was pressing Nehru. Nehru was caught up in a pair of scissors. As a person with his secular credentials, he wanted uniform civil code, and if that's not possible, the modern rational law for Hindu society, that is Hindu Code Bill. But he was also aware that the President has expressly and publicly stated, Rajendra Prasad had gone to the extent of also saying that if against my wish, the Lok Sabha still passes it, he said, I am going to resign. He had threatened, I am going to resign. The point is, generally we are given to understand that Rajendra Prasad objected to Hindu Code Bill because he was allegedly or supposedly a conservative Hindu. He had supported reconstruction of Somnath temple, mind you. Nehru, in his version of secularism, was against reconstruction of Somnath temple. But Sardar Patel, who was still there, Kanhaiya Lal Munshi, Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya, duly supported by Babu Rajendra Prasad, and Somnath was again reconstructed. A general image of like Rajendra Prasad as some sort of like conservative, or maybe sometimes in a demeaning fashion, a backward looking president. This is not true at all. This is absolutely not true at all. Rajendra Prasad's main objection was, why are you bringing this law only for one particular community? You want to bring in a modern rational law, bring it for everybody. So he was insisting that Article 44 should be followed and there should be uniform civil code. So don't single out one particular community and impose that law because that community is accepting. Make it for uniform for everybody. And therefore he had threatened that I will not sign. Nehru, with whatever like on each issue we study and pass comments with all due respect, was a hardcore Democrat who was aware that he is laying down the foundation of modern nascent democracy of India. If right at the start of it there is a conflict between two highest constitutional authorities in form of President and Prime Minister, there would be a chink, there would be a breach in the very foundation of our democracy. So he wanted to avoid this fight. Plus he was constitutionally also aware that as then, this was around 1955-56, there was no compulsion for the president to sign the bill passed by Lok Sabha and also forwarded by Council of Ministers. There was no compulsion till then. That is why the 42nd constitutional amendment comes into picture, and since then the president has very restricted powers. He hardly has president, he or she hardly has any independent discretionary powers. As compared to the president, in fact, governor has some discretionary powers. Probably the best example is Article 356. मला काही वेळा अशी शंका आहे की कोणते मुद्दे बोलतोय ते समोर लिहिल्याशिवाय काही जणांच्या भेजातच शिरत नाहीये. आज भरपूर होत आहेत ना मुद्दे, हे मी सांगतोय. आता माझा जरा फील सांगतोय मी, की अनेकांना काय सुधरतच नाहीये त्यांची. त्यांना वाटतंय सर बहुधा एक गोष्ट सांगतायत, पण गोष्ट सांगतायत म्हणजे ती सांगताना हजारो मुद्दे येतातच ना त्याच्यातले. देर आर इमर्जन्सी प्रोव्हिजन्स इन आर्टिकल 352, 356 and 360. Article 352 in its original form spoke about foreign aggression or internal disturbances, and a national emergency can be proclaimed. National emergency would mean fundamental rights stand abrogated and all powers are now taken over by Government of India in order to deal with this emergency. Article 360 talks about national emergency for economic reasons. Fortunately, this has never been invoked. Closest we can be said to have been to invoking Article 360 was July 1991, when India was staring at bankruptcy, which Pakistan is now and always. I mean, it's only a question of declaring Pakistan as bankrupt. Otherwise, if you see the latest economic reports of Pakistan, even as of today, Pakistan, either Pakistan is staring into bankruptcy or bankruptcy is staring into Pakistan. But India faced that situation only in 360, the situation where Article 360 would have been required to be invoked for declaring national emergency for economic reasons. I'm going to say, fortunately, we had Narsih Rao then, who showed the political vision and flexibility enough and steered India's ship across these troubled waters. 360 was never required to be used. Article 356 talks about breakdown of constitutional machinery in a state. Babasaheb Ambedkar was die-hard against this article itself. He did not want this here. Article 356 confers the power on the governor, to form a conclusion that constitutional machinery in the state has broken down. Under the constitutional scheme, the governor is not even required to explain the decision or give any rationale. The very wording says it has to be to the subjective satisfaction of the governor. That if that person called governor is satisfied, then Article 356. All that governor has to do is to make a report to the president and declare that the government is dismissed. So all powers will go to the governor, and then governor, it means the state will be directly ruled by the president. The another term that is in vogue is president's rule is made applicable to the state. Ambedkar was against such a massive and a draconian, if one may say, power to be given to the governors. He was afraid that this would be used for political reasons. While dedicating the constitution to the country and on the specific debate about Article 356, Ambedkar is on record having said that I hope this remains a dead letter in the constitution, that this is never invoked. But his hopes have actually been betrayed. and Article 350, nobody can deny that Article 356 has been misused. And nobody will deny that the crime, it's a very harsh word really, but if one is to accuse, it's not like any one particular party misused it. Over a period of time, the post of governor ended up by becoming a political post. That is not expected in the constitution. Governor is the head of state for the state. Governor is supposed to be above all party considerations. But then over a period of time, governor as representative of the president, and of course governor will be appointed by the president, but only on the advice of the council of ministers. That presidents, there is hardly any independent power for president. President has to act on the advice of the council of ministers. So finally the matter becomes political one. Maybe somebody who is to be accommodated. Maybe somebody whose active political career is over gets appointed as a governor. And as the situation in India the political situation in India went on changing, there would be a different government at the center and another different government in particular states. Then the central government, that the party would appoint a party member as the governor of that particular state. That person's only job would be to harass the state government. And all parties are responsible for this. It's not like only Congress did it or only BJP did it. Every party or every alliance, whenever it was in power at the center and had powers enough to do, everyone has done it. Every other one has done it. In 1985, Karnataka and Andhra assemblies had 2/3 majorities each one, respectively. Karnataka government was Janata Dal government, headed by Ramakrishna Hegde, and Andhra government, with 2/3 majority in the house, was headed by N.T. Ramarao, the founder of Telugu Desam party. Both states had one common governor who was an active Congress person, and the central government was a Congress government. Out of blue and absolutely for no reason, this governor Ramarao dismissed the governments and recommended dissolution of the house and imposition of president's rule, and which was accordingly done. It's difficult to think of a better example for misuse of Article 356. And sadly enough, this has been it went on being misused every now and then. So the governor also has a greater discretionary power. This has happened in Sikkim, this has happened in Bihar, this has happened in Gujarat, and the stories could continue ad infinitum. So these three emergencies, and around Article 356, the post of the role of the president and the role of governor begins to come into picture. We will close today's session with reference to the national emergency of 1975. We also need to deal with one more area. Constitution defines the power to pass ordinances. This is a legislative power given to the executive. This is supposed to build in that element of flexibility and continuation of government as an institution. When the House is not in session, but a situation has come up where a certain law is required to be passed immediately, one way to get it done is to summon the session again, but that has a certain time frame, notices to be issued, dispatched to the members. It would still take time. So the via media designed by the Constitution is this power of ordinances, that the government, which is executive, with the signature of the president or the governor, if it's a state matter, pass that law, that is ordinance, bring the law into effect with the use of ordinance. But then any such law which comes in through ordinance is required to be passed by the House or both houses wherever there are bicameral legislatures within 180 days from the date of ordinance. If that doesn't happen, on 188th day, the ordinance is supposed to lapse automatically. To our misfortune, and it doesn't give me any pleasure to say that actually more often than not, the provision for ordinance also has been misused. And it's not like the misuse is a story of last decade or even last 2 decades. Right in the decade of 50s, many senior leaders, and there were many great parliamentarians, one after another. Please remember Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia, Pandit Deen Dayal Upadhyay himself, then Atal Bihari Vajpayee joined in 1957, N.G. Ranga, among the senior most of the MPs, who also was a member of the Constituent Assembly, Pilu Modi, Minu Masani, the members of Swatantra Party, then the party which was established by Chakravarti Rajgopalachari. Many outstanding parliamentarians have raised their objection right in the decade of 50s, mind you, against the tendency of the government to misuse ordinances. Right in 53, 54, 55, opposition MPs have charged the government that the government waits for the session to be over and then brings in ordinances. So you are actually misusing this power for ordinances. I will pick up just 2 examples in recent times to narrate this story. One is the Food Securities Bill, which was a pet project of, if one may say, Sonia Gandhi, the convener of UPA. Food Securities Bill was brought in as an ordinance in August 2013. July 2013 was brought in as an ordinance in July 2013. The whole issue of food security is an important one. It's not a political issue. It's not a party political issue. In the light of the future, we need to ensure food security for the country and food security for especially common man with greater focus on poorest of the poor. They happen to be almost 2/3 of our population even now. So there has to be this food security. I'm not going to explain the topic right now because it's a very complex one, and maybe when we start dealing with economy, we will talk about this. But Food Securities Bill is also in breach of World Trade Organization, the Charter of World Trade Organization. But Food Securities Bill was sought to be brought in. It so happens that an earlier session had ended just about 15 days ago, and the next one was supposed to begin in August. This is the monsoon session. The monsoon session was supposed to begin in the first week of August. So Food Securities Bill could be presented before the House, discussed, and as per the constitutional procedure, passed or not passed, whatever happens. There was no reason for Food Security Bill to be brought in as an ordinance. But UPA government, in its wisdom, chose to do so, and the ordinance was passed in July 2013. There is another classic case which takes us pretty deep into the study of the Constitution. This is Article 10. Why is my mind always confused? Is it 102 or 104? We will check it up. The point is disqualifications of elected representatives. The Constitution defines disqualifications of elected representatives. UPA government was sitting in power. BJP was the main opposition. Sonia Gandhi, an MP from Raebareli, was occupying many government posts. And this article defines one of the disqualifications of elected representatives is to occupy office of profit. So if an elected representative occupies an office of profit, the elected representative is liable to be disqualified. The Constitution does not define the term office of profit. So somebody could conclude that yes, Sonia Gandhi was on various posts which could be held as office of profit. As a political plan, BJP picked up Jaya Bachchan, who was an MP from with the support of Socialist Party. She was MP in Rajya Sabha from Uttar Pradesh. This was with Mulayam Singh's support. And she was also the president of Uttar Pradesh Bala Chitrapat Nirmiti Mahamandal. So the first attack was launched on Jaya Bachchan saying this is office of profit, a complaint to Election Commission. Please examine this, and if found correct, her membership of Rajya Sabha gets cancelled. Election Commission went into the question, held that Jaya Bachchan is occupying office of profit, so her membership of Rajya Sabha was cancelled. Once that precedent was set, there was entire attack on Sonia Gandhi, because she was on very many posts at that point of time. The attack went on, the uproar in the parliament went on, and then the UPA government brought in an ordinance. A constitutional amendment, mind you, in form of an ordinance. I hope you begin to see the gravity of the situation. Here is a constitutional amendment sought to be brought in as an ordinance. Okay? And what an intelligent ordinance it was, because there is no definition of office of profit. The amendment said, following posts are hereby declared as not office of profit, and a list of posts. Okay? That list consisted of all the posts held by Sonia Gandhi and Sonia Gandhi alone. So in the parliament, there was again an uproar and an attack that this is only being done for Madam. India's president then was who I would hold as one of the best, probably the best, not the only one. I would personally call Dr. Abdul Kalam. And in my way of looking at things, Dr. Radhakrishnan also as India's best presidents ever. Without any disrespect for the post or any other person who occupied that post, the way I look at it, I think of Dr. Abdul Kalam and Dr. Radhakrishnan as India's best presidents ever. It so happens that both come from Tamil Nadu and both come from adjacent villages. They come from adjacent villages. Dr. Abdul Kalam as president had expressed his displeasure over the way this was happening. And when there was an attack from the opposition saying you have only enlisted all the posts held by Sonia Gandhi, then the entire parliament sat together, prepared a list, and passed a constitutional amendment by absolute unanimity. Entire Lok Sabha came together on this. Now the lists, okay, I forgot to say one thing in between actually. After this attack, after the first initial ordinance which was attacked by the opposition, that it consists of only the list of posts occupied by Madam Sonia Gandhi. Sonia Gandhi resigned from MP's post. She said, okay, I accept the responsibility and I resign. And then she invited every single MP occupying some position of office of profit to now do the same. Okay? Even BJP had 42 MPs who could be said to have been occupying a post which was an office of profit. And while Sonia Gandhi was sure to be re-elected, not all 42 could be sure that they would be re-elected. And then for getting the pension, you are required to complete 5-year tenure. Then you get a pension. You just complete one 5-year tenure, you get the pension for rest of your life. There is no service as lucrative as being an MLA or MP. So the 5 years were required to be. So the whole parliament sat together, Lok Sabha, and prepared a list of all different posts. And the constitutional amendment was, following posts are hereby declared as not office of profit. Okay? Now they consisted of all different posts that various MPs of all parties together, they were occupying. They are not office of profit. See the way mind works. I would say, with the honesty of the purpose, the parliament should have defined office of profit. But instead of doing that, here is only a list that following posts are now taken out of the definition of, they are not office of profit. This is the similar case for breach of privilege also, mind you. This was the constitutional amendment passed by the Lok Sabha with absolute unanimity. And this was the only time when the president exercised his authority for what is called as pocket veto, that is not signing, or sending it back to the Council of Ministers for reconsideration, the democratic functioning says that the Council of Ministers or both houses have to respect the sentiments of the president, suitably modify it. Instead of doing all such things, the Council of Ministers send the same amendment back to the president, where thanks to 42nd Amendment, the president had no choice but to sign. Even then, Dr. Abdul Kalam did not sign. Then the provision for pocket veto says that if it remains unsigned for 21 days, the resolution is automatic, it stands passed. That eventually is my analysis. That's the reason why Dr. Abdul Kalam did not get the second tenure. His first tenure as president was from 2002 to 2007. I do think that he should have got the second tenure. He had health on his side. He was very much an active president who also became the symbol and an architect of the vision for India 2020, and he should have had the second tenure. But as of today, he was elected during NDA regime, come 2007, and it was UPA, the UPA government in general, but Sonia Gandhi in particular, refused to back Dr. Abdul Kalam. That's how we had our first ever female president of India. Probably as Indians, maybe residents of Pune, you have every reason to feel happy because Pratibha Patil became the president of India. But the misuse of the provisions for ordinances, and the watch tells me that we need to deal with national emergency. I think I will take 2 or 3 minutes to, is it possible to do it in 2 or 3 minutes? There already was a national emergency under Article 352 from October 1962. Chinese aggression, and Article 352 had been invoked. It was never withdrawn. Then in the parliamentary elections of 1971, socialist leader Raj Narayan contested election against Indira Ji from Rai Bareli constituency. She was elected with a massive difference, but Raj Narayan filed a suit, electoral suit against her in Allahabad High Court. The charges were electoral offences. It was misuse of government machinery and misuse of government people. Government people actively participated her electoral campaign. Both are offences under electoral law. Justice Jagmohan Sinha of Allahabad High Court heard the case and gave his decision on June 12, 1975. Indira Ji was held guilty as charged. That would mean her election is cancelled, and that would also mean she is debarred from electoral process for next 6 years. We know now that personally she had thought of resigning, stepping down until this happens. But Justice Jagmohan Sinha had given her a leeway in giving this decision, that he gave the decision, but he himself suspended the implementation of this, he himself stayed the implementation of this decision so that Indira Ji gets an opportunity to go to the Supreme Court. She filed an appeal to the Supreme Court. Justice V.K. Krishna Iyer heard her appeal and refused to grant a stay to the decision by Allahabad High Court, which means it would go into action. All he said is, since she is the Prime Minister, that is head of government, she can continue to run the government or participate Lok Sabha, but she cannot vote on the floor of Lok Sabha because she has lost MP's situation. I hope you see the all intricacies which we have already dealt with. This date was June 25, 1975. Indira Ji imposed national emergency under Article 352. That was because just a couple of days before June 25, Jai Prakash Narayan, a great and a truly selfless Gandhian, who was already heading an all-India anti-corruption crusade, had appealed to the police and the army not to fire at people as long as they were taking to their demonstration in satyagrahi fashion. Indiraji interpreted this as he was asking army and police to rebel against the duly elected government. So these are internal disturbances. The clause under 352 was foreign invasion or internal disturbances. So she used this clause and national emergency was imposed. A constitution was practically abrogated, no fundamental rights. Almost all opposition leaders except communist ones were imprisoned. RSS as an organization was banned. It is during that time that she introduced the words secular and socialist in the preamble under the 42nd constitutional amendment, extended the average tenure of the parliament by another year, that is 6 years every time, and the 42nd amendment also now brought in the clause the president shall sign. Eventually 42nd amendment to a large extent was corrected under the 44th amendment. The 42nd and 44th together are actually called mini constitution, but with the 44th amendment we also enter the overall area of fundamental rights and directive principles, and we will continue with them tomorrow.